Well, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to talk, and it's really good to benefit from the thinking of a diverse group of scholars like this. And Sean, I appreciate it. It's always nice to hear a shout out to the pride and joy of my university of Eleanor Ostrom. So I'm looking forward to talking with you more about that. Um, so we live in a bit of a paradox where we have unprecedented glut of factual information, but more misinformed citizens. We're inundated with data, research syntheses, expert reports, and policy briefs. Yet this information is spreading at unrivaled rates. Belief in disinformation is widespread, and expertise is under siege, partially due to the very architecture experts themselves have created in order to offer more democratic access to knowledge. So this presents a bit of a paradox. The issue isn't simply that people believe false things, it's that the institutional machinery for deciding what counts as truth is breaking down. And we see this in many areas, including famously in climate science and medical research, for instance, but also in education, which has been positioned as a target of, as well as a potential remedy to the misinformation seemingly inherent to the digital age. And a useful example of this is furries, and you might be familiar with them as a subculture that likes to dress up as anthropomorphic animal characters. And there's been a claim going around that schools are installing litter boxes to accommodate furries to use the bathroom. And we've seen this claim emerge in the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And it plays on a narrative about trans students using bathrooms. There's actually no evidence that this has ever taken place, and it's been repeatedly debunked by journalists, school inspectors, and officials. Um, but nonetheless, it spreads. It's been repeated by a politician running for the US Senate, by a candidate for the UK Parliament. And there's costs that go along with this. It wastes the time of people that are working in schools because they have to counter that misinformation. It contributes to the continued erosion of trust in public institutions. But nonetheless, it's gotten some traction. This has been repeated on Fox News and some of the leading podcasts and other news media. I'm sorry, other new media that we see nowadays. Repeated by advocacy organizations in different countries. And it sparked legislation in a number of US states to outlaw litter boxes in bathrooms. So even though it's somewhat funny, it's still presented as a threat on prominent websites in the US and the UK, even after being disproven. So that's an example of the central issue that I'm focusing on here. The problem of misinformation isn't simply a cognitive error in believing or sharing false information. It's also an institutional challenge, as emerging claimants to authority co-opt the symbols or expertise while bypassing the disciplines that make expertise credible. So the focus of the paper I'm writing is the challenges to and the strategies of established institutions and emerging claimants to the mantle of expertise in this new information ecosystem, particularly in light of previous upheavals. Um, I've been examining how different states and professional governance configurations enable or resist misinformation uh, across policy fields. And I'm focusing in particular, of course, on education policy. And just to clarify here, I use the term misinformation pretty broadly here in the talk today to include things like disinformation and other similar concepts such as malinformation and propaganda. So I'm speaking generally here, but in the paper I cover more of the distinctions between those subcategories. Also, I'll be using the term authority largely in terms of expertise, that is, somebody that's mastered a particular subject, rather than authority as a moniker of power, of those in power. And I'm drawing from a neo-institutional perspective, which is concerned with institutional environments. And in that regard, we can define expertise as more of a technical, as more than just technical knowledge. It's a socially organized claim to mastery of a subject. It's stabilized by professions, credentials, journals, disciplinary norms, and so forth. And I'll be also drawing on the governing knowledge commons framework as a bridge from which institutional theory moves towards misinformation governance. The GKC framework, which explicitly treats misinformation as a problem of communities, credibility, trust, and truth, um, helps us deal with the problem within everyday knowledge commons. And so I'll be, as I mentioned, taking more of a historical and comparative approach in this particular paper. drawing on some of my own work on this, as well as some of the more recent work on the effectiveness of different interventions to counter misinformation. So I've been thinking quite a bit about the different innovations in information technology, from the emergence of the alphabet to radio to more recent developments like digital communications. And we often see not only innovations in information production and access, but also subsequent social disruption, including, for better or for worse, challenges to established authority and to the emergence of new claimants to the title of expert. And when we think about those different innovations, we can think about how they are impacted, how they allow for a new entry of new participants, how they can contribute to greater proliferation of information. So I'm focusing here today on the printing press because I think it offers some interesting parallels and considerations for our current era of disruption. Like now, innovation didn't simply overturn authority at that time, it also altered the conditions under which institutions could govern knowledge. Print wasn't merely a communications device, but an agent of disruption, of change, and of power for both incumbent and insurgent institutions and actors. And in particular, identified three primary disruptions that are worth considering here with potential relevance for our current situation. First, the technical innovation lowered not just costs for information dissemination, but also for barriers to entry. So religious dissenters, pamphleteers, printers, translators, and vernacular writers could challenge clerical and scholarly monopolies. And I'm sure you can see some potential parallels to the current situation. Second, the printing press destabilized interpretive authority. The church didn't merely face more text, it faced unauthorized interpretation, rival communities, and alternative audiences as new claims to knowledge. And as it democratized access to information, print also sparked often violent social movements, popular and apocalyptic movements such as the German Peasants' War, the Anabaptists in Munster, the Ranters in England, all show how innovations in information technology can transform symbolic claims, grievances, and prophecies into mobilized communities. So third, print produced new institutional forms. In response to new claims for authority, we see the rise of new fields and professions such as publishers, editors, licensing regimes, professional bureaucrats, learned societies, peer-reviewed journals, citation practices, and eventually the professionalization of journalism. And all of these help construct new epistemic regimes. So the lesson from the print revolution is not that the old order was overturned, it's that authority migrated from established office towards procedural credibility. And I'm particularly interested here in what worked, what responses to this new innovation had longevity and impact. And I thought about this largely in terms of what were ineffective strategies and what were more impactful strategies, both for the established institutions, but also the emergent institutions or insurgents. And you can think of the established institutions centuries ago as things like the church or universities, where currently we might consider professions, researchers, or the legacy media as established institutions. Likewise, in terms of insurgents, certainly radical printers were a new type of organizational force at the time, where now we might think of some think tanks or online communities or influencers. And in looking at this, I think it was important to make a distinction between reactive and adaptive responses. Reactive responses tried to restore the prior epistemic order. Suppression of the printers, for example, through a papal edict in 1501, banning books, or post-publication censorship, adding books to the index of prohibited books, essentially trying to recover a monopoly over the interpretation of information. Adaptive responses, on the other hand, were more effective and long-standing. They accepted the new media ecology and built authority around it. This is in terms of counter publications, standardization of catechisms, new educational institutions, which resulted in stronger clerical and scholarly training, new conventions for scholarship, correction, citation, and peer review, for example, and eventually the professionalization of journalism and scientific publishing. And this resulted in new epistemic roles. Effective institutions didn't defeat the new medium, they learned to govern through it. And this has some implications for our current situation. For example, in Pakistan, where there's efforts to outlaw misinformation, and to suggest that approach has limited potential. Indeed, now even tempered suppression in the form of, say, content moderation or deplatforming, for example, can become a badge of legitimacy in alternative media ecosystems and thus worsen overall epistemic harm. Now, there's certainly limits to this analogy between the printing era and the current era. The digital era isn't simply print all over again. The technical affordances are different. Platform architecture produces personalized feeds, immediate metrics, influencer economies, algorithmic visibility, synthetic media, and low-cost content generation. But there's also some instructive parallels about what works. And I've been working on a model of this. New entrants can become powerful when they achieve four factors in this emerging ecosystem. One of those would be visibility. That is, they master the dominant communication infrastructure. Martin Luther, Thomas Müntzer were excellent at the pamphleteering wars centuries ago, just like podcasters and influencers have learned to master the new media. Um, it's simply getting heard within the cacophony of the infodemic. Legitimacy, where they borrow or manufacture credibility signals. For example, the Officina Lazeri in Krakow became a legitimate printing press because it partnered with people in power and borrowed their symbols. Nowadays, you can see things like Robert Kennedy's Children's Health Defense or the American Federation for Children, which established themselves as legitimate institutes, even though they don't have the same kind of pedigree that established ones do. A third factor is community. These insurgents tend to offer identity, a sense of belonging, and shared grievance or moral clarity. You can see this with aggrieved peasants or Anabaptists centuries ago, or with QAnon or some homeschooling groups now, for example. And finally, adaptability. They move quickly across claims, claims, platforms, and controversies. Especially when challenged, they can pivot and still remain salient despite being proven to be wrong. And examples of this would be emerging religious movements throughout history, but also now. And of course, Donald Trump is a great example of this, being able to pivot and remain salient. And essentially, expert-based institutions win on the technical validity, but they lose on visibility, identity, and speed. So there is some research on interventions in education, such as, for example, teaching media literacy, and it shows how schooling alone is insufficient as a response because misinformation takes root through cognitive, emotional, and social mechanisms, and approaches focused only on media literacy miss the role of community identity and social ties, for instance. So alternative information and misinformation succeeds not because it's more persuasive than established experts, but because it's often better adapted to the contemporary attention economy. So we can see this, across different policy fields. And it shows how using a commons-based model can help us understand how to deal with misinformation governance. For example, in terms of health, you're familiar with established institutions like medical professions, professional or public health agencies, journals, or regulatory bodies. And challengers would be familiar as well, things like influencers or anti-vaccine networks, alternative media ecosystems. So here the governance problem is not merely false belief, it's how risk and uncertainty and trust and institutional failure and identity are managed to counter this problem. In terms of climate, established institutions would be things like climate science, again, peer-reviewed journals, national academies, environmental agencies. But the insurgents are some ideological think tanks, often fossil fuel-funded advocacy groups, contrarian experts, and media systems that foster doubt or uncertainty. So again, we have a governance problem. It's manufactured doubt and the conversion of uncertainty into policy paralysis. Similar things are evident with education, which include the established forces there include things like the teachers' unions, universities, professional associations, state agencies, where we see challengers coming from grass tops or what we might call astroturf networks, advocacy groups, some partisan media, and some pseudo research institutes and think tanks, which I'll talk about. So the government problem is especially complex because education combines empirical claims, professional judgment, democratic control, parental authority, and moral conflict with personal experience, and as Aristotle noted some 24 centuries ago, competing worldviews. So we've seen the rise of pseudo expertise in a number of fields, including in education. And think tanks in particular have played a role in this. Here they're really interesting epistemic intermediaries, especially and to some degree uniquely in the US. Think tanks have become more ideological and agenda driven, with a significant transparency problem around think tank funding. Some of the work I've done looking at public influence and expertise within think tanks involved in policy often shows that their influence often eclipses their expertise. And some of the think tanks with the greatest level of expertise have very little influence, whereas some of the most influential have very little expertise in their fields. So return to this idea of the knowledge commons in these three areas. In all three domains, misinformation can travel through established and emerging institutions, not just around them, but in different ways. It can be brokered by journals, conferences, think tanks, and media outlets, professional networks, platforms, and state agencies, which often end up emulating the symbols of legitimacy. The case of education is particularly interesting. It's similar, but has some unique attributes. It's a largely permeable institution, open or sensitive to exit and local preferences, competing constituencies, such as employers, civic traditions, and parents, competing models, whether it's a scientific, political, or market enterprise. And of course, everyone's an expert. Everyone's been through school, so they have an opinion. But schooling in particular is positioned both as a target and a remedy to the problem of misinformation. So it raises the question about how the global knowledge, governing knowledge commons perspective can help us understand how to deal with these issues. Of course, the framework draws on, again, on Elinor Ostrom's work to think about the misuse of common pool resources. And we treat, in this regard, misinformation as a resource within the commons structure. And it encourages us to move from whether or not a claim is false and how to counter it to thinking instead about community level perspectives. Who controls the infrastructure that lets the claim spread? What incentives advance the claim? Who has authority in the action arena? What counts as evidence when a claim becomes policy relevant? You can see how this plays out across three aspects of the knowledge cycle in terms of production, dissemination, and use. This suggests that institutions need to revisit things like peer review, which we all know is problematic, or replications of studies, thinking about conflicts of interest disorder, and correction and retraction procedures. And also professional discipline, how we police our different disciplines when we see misrepresentation of data. Academic integrity in particular is a very significant issue here, since it's often used by insurgents to delegitimize university-based knowledge as misinformation. This highlights how higher education's internal knowledge guidance, knowledge governance, and incentive systems need to be reconfigured rather than merely defended, especially in the face of jurisdictional challengers like think tanks, advocacy organizations, and online influencers. Secondly, when we think about research propagation or dissemination, expert-based institutions can shape that circulation through a number of factors, none of which is on its own sufficient. Things like pre-bunking or adding friction before sharing, for example, rapid response networks, elevating trusted messengers to be liaisons to the public around more sophisticated research findings, for example, looking at community relations or connections with new media, and also using librarians and teachers as knowledge brokers. Norway offers a really interesting model for balancing freedom of expression with the need for good information. Rather than reactive fact-checking, entities like Factist, funded by a diverse set of media entities, reflect proactive efforts to cultivate a public culture that values knowledge, inquiry, research, press freedom, and critical thinking. When we think about governing knowledge use, institutions have to create procedures for when claims become policy relevant. Agencies need to require evidentiary documentation for factual claims. That is, are there actual furries in schools? And transparency around the evidence base for decisions. The central governance question is not only, is the claim true, but it's, What institutional rules allow this claim to shape policy? So finally, turning back to public education, it shouldn't be framed merely as a place to teach students to spot fake news. Instead, media literacy has been shown to be only marginally effective and only under some conditions. But while it has limited potential as an antidote to misinformation from jurisdictional challengers, its role as one of democracy's core knowledge governance institutions means that we should consider the ways to restructure education to withstand misinformation. And this means 4 functions for education: teaching how knowledge is made, also teaching civic epistemology as far as how societies decide what counts in different fields, such as law, science, journalism, medicine, and how those fields relate. It means building institutional routines around evidence standards, organizational response protocols, and verification networks, and creating local knowledge commons. Schools, universities, libraries, journalists can all play a role in those types of things. That is, schools matter, but misinformation is not solved by individual critical thinking alone. The types of responses that are available, things like informational responses, educational responses, institutional countermeasures, suggest multiple ways that education can be embedded in broader institutional designs. So in conclusion, when we think about using this governing knowledge commons framework, taking lessons from the past, we have to accept that misinformation is now a permanent feature on the landscape in the digital era. And most effective ways to address it are adaptive, working within the logic of the landscape rather than reactive, trying to reestablish old institutions and norms. This means that the old gatekeeping environment of the broadcast to print era is not coming back, and we shouldn't confuse information abundance with epistemic democracy. It suggests treating misinformation not only as false claims, but as institutional destabilization, and building procedural credibility through transparency, correction, review, disclosure, and accountability. It suggests the need to nurture new intermediary networks and professions and embed public education as part of a democratic knowledge governance commons. The democratic task here is not to restore automatic deference to experts. It's to build knowledge commons in which expertise is visible, contestable, accountable, and worth trusting. So with that, I will address questions or hear comments, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Congratulations. And this is a very important problem. The French Academy of Technology is currently publishing a report exactly on the question that you just described. And I think we would have benefited from your input, actually, to make it more clear. And while our colleagues are preparing to raise their hands, I'd like to first thank you to add schools as an information technology. I think this is something that we often forget. And then, I mean, I really liked especially your number 27 slide where you show the production, propagation, and then the impact, the use of information. And if we want to do things, I mean, this is exactly, I like that because selfishly, this is the kind of thing I teach my students, is that if you want an intervention to be efficient, it has to go directly at the point of action. There's no way trying to do something generic. And what you're showing us with your very clear description of what is happening is that there are several points for intervention. There's one which is the production of this knowledge. And we now know that we have new sources, but they're identified. The second one is the propagation. And the third one is the moment where this content gets into the destinator and is interpreted, right? And so that's a third point, which you say we should teach people to be more critical and give them the tools for this. And I think that the way that we're addressing this problem at the moment is in a way too generic. We need to have a series of interventions, and I think that's what you're pushing forward, that are destinated to the various steps of that process by which through the information is produced, legitimated, transferred by a series of media and then analyzed. It's just not just one single silver bullet that will do this. It's a series of things that are targeted at the point of action of this process of dissemination of toxic information.
It's a good word, yeah.
Natalie, and then Alienor. Natalie.
Thank you, Chris. I really enjoyed your talk. I especially liked how you emphasized procedural credibility and relevance for communities. I'm wondering whether, like in your two categories of reactive and adaptive, if you see there may be another category for proactive strategies, especially in terms of, because you compared the printing press and the web environment today, the digital environment, whether in both timeframes you could identify cases in which actors not only adapted the content production to the new technology, but also produced technological tools, along with reframing their way of producing knowledge. So I'm thinking, for example, of in today's context, in the current context, about open source software. So yes, I'm wondering if this could be, because it's interesting. Tomorrow I will be talking about knowledge commons and Wikimedia, the Wikimedia movement and open knowledge commons. And I've also worked on a framework about reactive, adaptive, and then I included proactive strategies, thinking, yes. So I'm just pitching this around. Maybe it's not relevant at all, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, I want to talk with you some more about that. That's really interesting. Some parts, some elements of being proactive are difficult in an era of fluid innovation. If you asked people in 1525 how they could be proactive as far as the effects of the printing press and the rise of new professions, I think most people would have difficulty projecting forward about what types of institutions or mechanisms would be effective a generation or two later. I think that's somewhat similar now that, things are changing so fast. AI is improving, at an exponential rate, for example. And, so that means that efforts towards misinformation are going to be much more difficult to contain. So it's hard to envision what that might look like 3 years from now, and to be proactive towards that. I do think, and I'd like to talk with you about this as far as how do we incentivize platforms, to be proactive and not privileging misinformation, and letting corrective information get a jump on the virality of misinformation that goes out. So I do think a lot of us might point to incentives and disincentives right now in the current, the platformized situation that we're in. But yeah, let's talk about it at lunch. Look forward to it. I'd like to learn more from you. I think Eleanor, did you?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm also researching democratic backsliding, so I know how far misinformation is part of the problem. I guess my question is about trust and the reception of your proposals. It's because most of the time, proposals suggesting that we should use school to give some literacy about information, and as you put it, like putting democratic knowledge part of the syllabus, are more about restoring trust. But what about restoring the trustworthiness of institutions that would deserve trust?
Yeah.
Because if we don't talk about that first, the risk is that you will have citizens or students, let's say, who will say, yeah, I'm very happy to receive these courses, but I'm not sure why I should trust. like mainstream medias or old medias about this information, or why I should trust judges about this court decision. So how about finding a balance between restoring trust of those who receive information and also improving the trustworthiness of those who produce information?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a great question, and we're seeing that exact issue play out as far as new and legacy media right now. Um, I think traditionally there's been more socio-cultural um, uh, forces at play with regard to trust. If somebody was not reliable over time, they would lose trust, for example. So veracity became a currency in some regard. And a lack of being wrong on your predictions or on what you had to share would cost people as far as their standing within a community. That's no longer true. Trust is based on how many times you're liked or reshared rather than whether or not you're accurate. So I think that we're not in the same type of situation where simply providing more accurate information will build trust anymore. I did end my presentation talking about, we have to become worthy of being trustworthy, but as far as the information we provide. But in fact, people don't necessarily go to information that's accurate. They go to information that inflames them, that entertains them. And so it becomes a quite a different landscape for us to think about, reinvigorating trust within established institutions. And I think it points to looking at new intermediary networks that can help people sort through the infodemic and realize what's useful and what stuff needs to be taken with a grain of salt, to say the least. Yeah.
Thank you. Lisa?
Yes. Thank you. Can you all hear me correctly?
Mm-hmm.
Good. Thanks. Many thanks, Chris, for the presentation, which I enjoyed. I was wondering, somehow it seems that your thinking is premised on the idea that the receiving end, so the public, will be in search of knowledge of some kind. So be it misinformed knowledge or misinformation of the kind of knowledge that you would seek to promote through institutional refinement. But then, because I'm an anthropologist, but perhaps it's also true in other disciplines like sociopsychology, the question of knowledge is increasingly thought in relation to what it seems to be its immediate opposite, like ignorance and willful ignorance in particular.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering if this is something that you've been considering. So I'm not working on democratic societies. My fieldwork is in China. But well, it would be too long to tell you the story. But I've started writing a paper some time ago, which I've never finished, which involved this very question of willful ignorance and willingness to trust informations that at the same time, I think people are under dupes about their so-called fakeness.
Mm-hmm.
And often people seem to have, for the best or worst, good reasons to engage with this material also, and to offer some trust to them. I was wondering if this is something that you considered.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That was a great question. And I'd say I don't see willful ignorance happening in isolation. It tends to happen with people can share that willful ignorance with others because it's a question of community, belonging to a community that rejects the mainstream knowledge around something, for example. So I think that points to the importance of kind of the sociocultural explanation for this. I'm sorry that you understood my premise to suggest that people are searching for information or the truth. I don't know if that was necessarily the premise I was trying to project. I think in the current environment, actually, we've moved away from the demand side of people necessarily looking for the truth online, and instead they're being inundated with noise. And so it becomes a supply side question for knowledge producers, for example. How do you get heard above that noise? And so it changes the nature of the landscape to some degree, where it becomes in a way a seller's market. I think you could say, how do trustworthy knowledge producers then have any kind of advantage over people that are selling stuff that inflames passions, pisses people, gets people upset, and tends to get heard more than reading a journal article, for example. Yeah, I don't want to suggest that my premise is that necessarily people are always out there looking for information. That certainly does happen, but I think the situation is much more complex than that, where you have so many voices right now trying to be heard.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sean?
Hey, Chris, thank you very much. I appreciated the printing press analogy. I guess your second anthropologist in a row here, but I'm going to draw on it like it's a broad field. So we have a wide canon. On a different part of it, we have people like Marvin Harris, sort of this idea of cultural materialism. And, the printing press kind of got me thinking about the technologies that underlie the phenomenon that you're studying.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, then my brain took a lateral jump to Marshall McLuhan, which
Yeah.
may be more
Yep.
relevant.
Yep.
But it just got me thinking, like I think, intuitively, many of us think this is different. Like something different is going on in the current information environment than what happened with the printing press. I
Absolutely.
don't know. I didn't live through that transition. Maybe those folks felt the same. But my suspicion is that this is like an order of magnitude different, and that there's something, there's like evolutionary dynamics with relation to sort of information movement and communication going on. And so I guess it was just maybe a provocation for you to ask whether McLuhan's idea of the medium is the message gives us a way of thinking about what qualitatively might be different in this information environment, and whether that can kind of condition the adaptive responses that you're calling for. Because we know a lot about how technology changes and how it drives changes in societies, as you pointed out. And so I just wonder if there's some sort of like, can we draw on the received knowledge of our forebears here to make better guesses for sort of information adaptation?
Right. Yeah, I don't want to oversell the analogy, but Marshall McLuhan also wrote a book called Gutenberg's Universe, where he talked about how the printing press changed not just social relations, people's connection to authority, but also changed people's thinking. It changed how the mind worked. And I think in that respect, there are some similarities to the current digital age, where certainly the amount of the points of information that are aimed at us now every day are, you're right, by exponentially larger than they were to somebody several centuries ago. But nonetheless, the sudden destabilization of professions through that innovation, I think, is still important. People that relied on kind of established institutions to say that they were able to interpret truth were suddenly challenged by somebody else that was able to basically look that up at the time and and then argue, no, they had a different interpretation of that. That had been something that hadn't happened before. And so, you see in a lot of those social movements at the time, the printing press was essentially the Twitter of its time. You literally had examples of people, rebels who came together around pamphlets, and then getting in, violent battles with authorities, stuffing pamphlets and cannons and shooting them out at other people. And it reminds me a bit of social media now. So I think you're right. This can be oversold, that parallel, but I also think that there are some, especially as far as the threats to established institutions. I think there's some lessons that can be learned from the past.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris.